Good morning. I'd like to talk a little bit this morning about some aspects of my new course that's getting ready to be launched, Trauma in the Family Tree. Now, often when we think about trauma in genealogy research, military research, we're looking at a death event. That's probably the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about trauma, because often we'll link it to a death certificate or a newspaper article about an accident or some medical thing that happened at somebody's death. Or they served in the military, they're in a war, and their death was very traumatic. So we record those events in our family tree. Sometimes we might stumble upon a newspaper article or court document, family story that describes another traumatic event that happened that we don't record, because in the course of what we do record in genealogy history and what we're never taught to record all of those traumatic events. And quite honestly, they're not all necessary for the whole world to know about, but we still should be recording them in some way, whether it's public or private, depending on what kind of event it was. Now, in my Trauma in the Family Tree class, we're going to explore trauma as a biographical event. We're going to look at collective trauma. We're going to look at personal trauma, and then we're going to look at how can we start to heal this energetically. What are some of the tools that you can use? And there are so many, not just tools, but energy modalities and ways that you can heal these things. But one thing I'd like to get you thinking about, especially if you're considering taking this course, it will be the 27th of February, 2021, and it will begin at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time, and it will run for about 3 hours. And there will be short breaks within each section so that we can just step back for a moment and breathe before we go on to the next one. But when we talk specifically about trauma as a biographical event, there are a lot of other things we could be recording that affect us, affect our inner children, affect our chakra system, where we hold energy from birth throughout our entire lives, that we don't think about, we don't record. And again, might not be for public knowledge. It might be a Word document that you keep separately for yourself as you discover these things, or they surface about yourself or your family or some of your ancestors. So we will be working with some tools that will give you a way to really look at, map out some of these events. And then there will be available some follow-up courses and support for people who want to take this deeper, because we'll just be doing broad strokes in this first course. So, what are some examples of traumatic events that are biographical that we probably should record somewhere? Well, if you think about it, probably a lot of these things were recorded. How many of you keep a diary or a journal? How many of you write about all the bad stuff that happens in your life or your family's life? Or, you stumbled upon a story. How many of you have taken pictures where things maybe turned out not so great, that it had a serious impact on you? How many of you have documents and photos and scrapbooks and newspaper articles and other things just sitting around that you've either accumulated through your own research or you've gotten from family members that have a bunch of clues? So, some of the places that we can start, and I'll just give you a few examples so that you can sit with this, because we'll go more in depth in the class, is looking at our own traumatic events. So if I look at my life, I can look at the fact that, I live in the Chicago area right now. I was born and lived for the first 5 years of my life about 3-4 miles from where I currently live. But at the age of 5, my parents decided they wanted a different kind of life, and they moved us out of the Chicago area down to Southwest Missouri, where I spent all of my growing up time. That was a seriously traumatic event for me, okay? There were, as I can look back on it now, but I couldn't verbalize then, but my mother wrote a lot of stories about our first year or so in this new life, and she talked a lot about, how I was having none of it and how she dealt with it. But, being the oldest in my family and moving at the age of 5, You can look at, there were maybe abandonment issues. I was abandoned kind of by my family that was still living in Chicago, even though they had no control over the choices that were being made. There could be that. There was the trauma of having to move to an entirely different place where we were basically secluded. Then I started kindergarten and I barely started first grade, and then we moved again. Not too far away, but enough that I had to start over again. So as a 5 and 6 and maybe almost 7-year-old, depending on what the exact timing was, I had moved twice. I had given up friends that I had just made. I had left all my little preschool friends in the Chicago area behind. Everything was very different. And that had a serious impact on me. And I held a lot of anger in that for most of my life. And I could not wait to escape and get out of there, because the state of misery was not where I wanted to be. My heart beat in Chicago. But it took like 20 years before I finally made that jump and came back. But when we look at some of that and, what else was happening around all of that move, what might have been happening in my early childhood, we store a lot of that in our chakra system, our energetic system, mostly in the first 3 chakras. The root, where we talk about safety, security, family, abundance or lack. The sacral chakra, which is the second one, where there's sexual energy, sensual energy, creative energy, and all of these different things. And then the 3rd chakra is the solar plexus, where we keep our personal power. And when those start to close down because we're protecting ourselves from all of this stuff that we can't verbalize, deal with, process emotionally, we don't have the tools, which most of us didn't as young children, it gets stuck. And it creates a whole lot of stuff in our lives that may or may not, at some point, show up later and create what we might consider another traumatic event, or it shows up in response to a traumatic event, or it could be affected by the place that we're visiting or we're in. I've had things happen to me as I travel in Europe that have triggered old wounds, not only from this life, but my ancestral lineage, that showed up, and it was very obvious. I couldn't ignore it anymore, or I didn't even know it was there, and wow, there it is. Now it's time to look at it. And how do I heal it? How do I let the past go for myself, my living family, and my ancestors? So what other biographical events could we record? Well, my boy's father had cancer. That was a huge biographical trauma event. So everything around that and the effects of that afterward created a lot of stuff for me. Not only for him, but if I'm looking at myself personally, there were a lot of things that happened after that. And the ability to even have children after that was kind of taken away, unless I did IVF, which I did. And that's a whole other big traumatic event. And most of that I pushed down, which we tend to do. We don't want to look at it, or we don't know how to deal with it in the moment. And sometimes it sits until we have space to process it. So those would be other events. You might have the birth of your child. Maybe while it's a beautiful event, maybe there was something traumatic that happened. A cord wrapped around the neck, or maybe an emergency C-section or something like that. Maybe finding out that your baby had a hole in the heart after birth. It could be a lot of those things that we don't necessarily see as traumatic events, because maybe they're mixed in with some really good stuff, but yet they affect us and they can trigger old wounds. So these are some of the events that you might want to start taking a look at in your personal life, the lives of your living relatives and your ancestors, to see what are the happy things that might have been mixed in with a little not so good, and what are the things that we would normally consider traumatic events. And then maybe sit back and look at, what core wounds does this touch? Abandonment, lack, unworthiness, what are those things? Because those are things that you are being called to work on. So we will dive more into this in this course. There will be some worksheets and a lot more examples of events that you can look at for your personal life and your family's history, and how we can work to heal those things after we've identified them. If you're interested, click the link in this bio, sign up for my Ancestral Souls mailing list to be the first to be notified about the class. Bye.